Welcome back to Graveyard Graham's Midnight Ride. This is kind of a part one of two review because I'm reading a book called Dreamer of Dune by Brian Herbert. Despite the title, it's not actually a Dune book. It's a biography of his father, Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune. And I'm not quite halfway through it, but I'm really liking it. He starts out with a little bit of family history. He covers his grandfather and then his father and then his own childhood, because he was like a teen or so. He doesn't like really get into the specifics of the ages and stuff. He just talks about how they moved around a lot as a kid when he was a kid for various reasons. But he was either a teen or a preteen when his dad was researching and then writing Dune. And as I'm listening to this particular part of the book, it reminds me of a discussion that I had with Brett Kane on the Ironside podcast about 2 years back. We were comparing Beau L'Amour to Christopher Tolkien and Brian Herbert. These are all sons of very famous and successful and well-established authors who were involved in curating the works of their fathers and like preserving them and taking them to the next generation. They've kind of all gone about it different ways. Beau L'Amour recently, like over the last couple of years, has been involved in the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures aspect, where he and his mom and stuff have had to like comb through his late father's works because the man just was constantly producing. And I've got volume 1 of those Lost Treasures that I still need to review here. But throughout his life, I mean, he just wrote tons and tons of stuff. Not all of it got published, not all of it got finished, and there were various versions of the same story. This wasn't in the age of hard drives where you could just save version 1, version 2, version 3. This was like the typewriter era where you would type something out, it didn't work, you'd set it aside, type something else out, yada, yada, yada. He ended up having folders and folders of various books, and Beau L'Amour had to curate all that into this Lost Treasures compendium. Christopher Tolkien had a similar role in J.R.R. Tolkien's work, and in fact, I would say that most of the Tolkien books that we have been published after his death and edited and compiled by Christopher, who was really the last defender of his father's legacy. If I've heard right, the Tolkien estate voted to sell film rights to Amazon for $250,000 and kind of overrode Christopher's opposition. And Amazon didn't really get that production truly underway until Christopher died in 2020. It was about 2.5 years later that season 1 of Rings of Power premiered. So it was like literally over in a over my dead body sense. Christopher Tolkien is also on the record as not approving of Peter Jackson's film treatment of Lord of the Rings. Like, he had such a close involvement with his father's work that he really was the last living authority on it. And as much as I love those movies and that music and stuff, like, I understand where Christopher was coming from based on just the little bit of in-depth stuff that I've read about Tolkien. And now I'm in this part where I'm reading Brian Herbert's perspective on his father's creation of Dune. I've read like 1 to 1.5 of the Dune books that were not written by Frank. I read the Butlerian Jihad, which I thought was good. I started to read The Machine Crusade, and I decided, okay, I don't want to go into this much detail into the backstory. It's under that umbrella of things where the mystery, I think, is more fascinating than overly defining the mystery and the backstory and the lore. I guess there's, I don't know how many Dune books there are now, most of which at this point have been written by Kevin J. Anderson in association with Brian Herbert, who, like Beau L'Amour, like Christopher Tolkien, is kind of the custodian of his father's estate. All three of these men had different relationships with their father in their youth. I still need to read more details about Christopher Tolkien's childhood, but he was obviously very close with his father and was very adamant about preserving his father's work and the integrity of it and the legacy of it after his father's passing in 1973. I've only read fond things from Beau L'Amour about his father Louis and what his childhood was like and how hard Louis worked to provide for his family as a writer. Brian Herbert brings kind of a different perspective, and I think that's why it was important to share his father's childhood with him, with the reader, just so that you could understand like where his father got his values from and why he raised his sons the way that he did. I look at this as a working dad and a writer myself. I don't make a whole lot of money off of my writing in a year. Like I might be able to cover a few things here and there, but that's it. Brian Herbert and his wife, they were both writers, and they went whole hog on the writing career thing. But at times here and there, he had to take different writing jobs. He would work as a speechwriter and stuff for different politicians when they were campaigning, but that was inconsistent. You could only get that kind of work when it was campaign season. Most of the time it was his mom working full-time, and it was Frank trying to sell short stories that weren't selling or weren't working, and the family living off of very, very little money and moving around a lot to avoid creditors until Dune took off, and then he was able to settle his debts and stuff. I think a lot about like people who were very accomplished, very successful, and also tried to be family men because, hey, here I am being a family man. I want to be very accomplished. I want to be very successful. But there are a couple of ways to get there, and there are certain ways that I don't want to take. I don't want to make my family go without essentials. I'm morally opposed to debt, even though I have some of it, and I'm working against it. I think I would struggle with the idea of like deliberately running into that all in service of pursuing my dream of being a full-time writer. Obviously things worked out in the end for Frank Herbert, but geez, like how many guys try to do it that same way and don't end up writing something as consequential as Dune, or even something that sells as much and kind of validates the effort in the end with sales. You see the same thing happening with athletes, and this is where I'm going to compare two Colts quarterbacks. A book that I read in 2017 was called The Man with the Golden Arm by Johnny Unitas Jr. Johnny Unitas was a quarterback for the Baltimore Colts in the 50s and 60s, I think all the way up into the 70s, early 70s. He ended up finishing with the Chargers and didn't have a great record. It was the end of his career at that point, and the league was changing and stuff. But he was the man that brought them their first national title in January of 1959. It was the 1958 season. There's another book by Mark Bowden called like the Greatest Game Ever or The Best Game Ever, something to that effect. It's about that title game, the Colts versus the Giants. Fantastic read. Johnny Unitas was a very gifted athlete, and his style of play, both mentally and physically, changed the game and made it more exciting and helped usher it into the national level. But the biography of Johnny Unitas, written by his son, shows what his home life was like and his family life was like. Kind of like Frank Herbert, he was raised in a tough era of emotionally detached fathers, and that shaped his own view of what fatherhood was supposed to be, and he was kind of a rough dad. He also divorced his first wife and married a mistress, and John Jr. was, like, he didn't really hold back in his book about how much he didn't like his stepmom. But for a long time there in his early adult years, he was distant and kind of estranged from his father in the whole, like, long hair hippie rebellion era. But he eventually patched things up and ended up being kind of a business manager for him until his death in 2002. He was a man that he had to share with the world. John Jr., even when his dad died, and there was like this citywide funeral parade for Johnny Unitas, John Jr. mentioned in the book, he's like, I would have liked to have just had my dad do myself, but we had to share him with this second wife that nobody liked, and the entire city that showed up for his funeral, which I understand, but at the same time, like, he could never just be my dad. 5 years ago this summer, another Colts quarterback, Andrew Luck, retired after just 7 seasons, I want to say, in the NFL. A generational talent, a truly electrifying player to watch when he was healthy, but he just got beat up a lot because his general manager, Ryan Grigson, didn't believe in paying for actual protection on the O-line. He kept buying these stunt and gadget contracts for players, and Andrew Luck kept getting injured and not getting better. And ironically enough, he was rehabbing and recovering from a shoulder injury right around the same time I was. And at the time, like, I was not prepared for the psychological take or burden of recovering from an injury like that, and how hard it is to be limited when you're used to being completely whole. And this is just as a guy who was in this 18-month window of recovering from a shoulder injury to be a grunt worker. Like, imagine the pressure on you to recover from shoulder surgery as a star NFL quarterback, #1 overall draft pick type guy. And the fact that he wasn't recovering from his injuries, it completely, in his own words, like, sapped the joy out of playing the game. And it was affecting his marriage. He had just, in the last year or so, gotten married to his wife. They were expecting a kid, and she was the one who was there with him through the rehab. They spent a couple of months in the Netherlands going through a fix-up period on his shoulder. It was hard, and he ultimately decided to walk away from the game and from millions and millions of dollars in service of his family. I remember, like, getting on YouTube even back then and saying, like, I get this. And to all the fans who booed him when they found out, like, screw you guys. No amount of money can change the fact that his wife was there before he got famous, and his wife will be there after his career retires. You guys are just there as fans for now, but who's going to be there the entire time? It's the people that love him, and he's doing what's right by them. Overall, I think that's the takeaway of studying the lives of men like this. Beau Lamore, Christopher Tolkien, Brian Herbert, and then, hearing from Andrew Luck and hearing from John Unitas Jr., just about the relationship that they have, either like to their fathers who were immensely successful and famous, or in Andrew Luck's case, somebody who was famous himself. There's a cost to all of these things, and while there is a benefit to it, in Andrew Luck's case, he still had the rest of a $140 million contract to pay out. What do you value most? He loved his wife, he had his family, he had his education, and he had more in life than just the desire to be famous and play football. Obviously, not every athlete is going to be in the same situation. It is what it is. Take from that what you will. But this is where I'm glad to be reading books like this and benefiting from them, because it just reminds me, like, I could completely burn out on the author thing, but there's a price that I'm not going to make my family pay in order to achieve that. I'm going to take a different route, and I am going to get there. I don't care how long it takes. I'm just going to do it in a way that serves the best needs of my family. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think. Till next time, drive safe. See you out there.